Back in 99, 2000, just tell me a bit about what you were doing. Where were you at in your life before you volunteered to go overseas?
I had just recently immigrated to Alberta from BC, and I was kind of struggling along. I was trying to start my own business, a drywall company, and there was a bit of a downturn in the economy, and I was doing well, but I wasn't getting rich, that's for sure. And I'd left Victoria because I didn't see a future of ever being able to own a house or really kind of get ahead in that city. It was just too expensive. So I just up and left mom and dad and ran to Alberta to see if I could make it on my own.
So why did you volunteer to go to Bosnia at that time?
It was actually the second time I volunteered to go to Bosnia. I volunteered back in 1995 and went through the whole workup training, and then we didn't go. The UN pulled out of Croatia, and my tour just got canceled. And I ever since 1992 when I joined, and my friends all went to Cyprus and I couldn't go because I was too new, and then I was going to go to Bosnia in 93 and I was still in high school and it just wasn't going to work out. So in 95 I really wanted to go and I couldn't go in 95, and then there was some other tours in 97 and I was so disenfranchised about, like, I didn't think they were going to go, to be honest with you, you know, because my tour didn't go. I didn't think anybody was going to go again, and then guys went, and I was mad again because I didn't go. And so finally in 2000 a tour came up, and I wasn't going to miss another one. So I was in a hurry to get overseas and see all the things that, you know, I had heard about for the 8 years I'd been in the Army by at that point.
So, yeah, so what was it? Like, what was your driving motivation?
It's really hard to pinpoint. I wanted to see different countries. I wanted to travel without having to pay the money to travel. I remember guys coming home from overseas and they'd have, $8,000-$10,000 in their bank account, and that appealed to me. I wanted the adventure of it. It was just doing something that was out of the norm, just something different. I'd like to say that it was to serve my country or something. It really wasn't. It was all for me. It was stuff I wanted to do.
How old were you at the time?
2000, I would have been 25, 26.
So were you married, single then?
I was single.
So what did your family and friends say when you said, I'm going to Bosnia?
Well, they had been through it already once, and they had huge reservations. Like when I tried to go in 93, it was a big battle with my dad, and there's no goddamn way, because I wanted to drop out of high school to go overseas. So, and then when I went, and I was going in 1995, they were really worried, and I tried to tell them, like it's not that bad over there, and I'll be fine. And so when I finally in 99 was going, then they were almost used to it by then, and so I'm sure they had their concerns. They didn't voice it to me as much. But like I said, I had 2 years ago, I'd moved away to a different province, and it's not like I was over there for supper and had supper with mom and dad anymore or anything like that. So there's that huge separation that I probably didn't get to see their concerns.
Are you the first person or the only person in your family to have any kind of a military background?
No, my grandfather was a career Navy guy. Joined as a boy seaman, served all the way through the war, became a chief petty officer, commissioned, and went to lieutenant colonel, and I think he did 37 years.
So what about your workup training? What did you do? Where did you do it to get ready to go to Bosnia?
We started our workup training in Shiloh. The whole workup training was in Shiloh. Some of the guys went on a trip down to the States. We did some stuff at the old air base in Verdun, but for the most part it was in Shiloh. And we trained as if we were going to war. The NATO tour, like when I did workup training back in 1995, it had a completely different feel. They were all about the UN stuff, and you couldn't even load your rifle, and to me it just seemed crazy, and in a way I'm glad I never did anything with the UN. They terrify me as an organization. But the NATO workup training had totally different feel. We were planning for the worst and hoping for the best, and it seemed very professional. The final exercise that we were on before we went overseas was one of the hardest exercises I've ever been on in my military career. We didn't sleep for 4 or 5 days. They just ran us full out, and mine strikes and ambushes and everything. And then we got overseas and none of that stuff happened. Well, thank God. It was a relatively quiet tour. It was, pretty easy going.
Which unit did you go over with?
1 RCA, A battery.
So what were your, based on the workup training and any, what you knew about the situation, what were your expectations before you headed over? What did you think you were getting into?
Well, by 2000, I was pretty confident that the war was over and that it was more of a policing thing than a fighting or peacekeeping even thing. I didn't expect to be getting in any gunfights or, they had been there for 8 years, so they knew all the routes, and they, like the mine threat, which was the biggest threat there, had been pretty much resolved by the time I went over there. It was still weighed heavily on our minds, right? Because they cleared all the roads, and that's almost all they did. So I wasn't expecting any danger at all when I went over.
What were you hoping for? Like, what did you want from this tour in terms of personal experience?
Oh, I just really wanted a good tour with a good supervisor, and because I was going there. It was a job, right? And it was an exciting job that I was going to see a whole bunch of stuff, but I just wanted it to go off without a hitch, and for the most part it did. I was pretty lucky.
How, when you look back at your workup training now, and then how the tour rolled out, how well prepared do you think you were for that?
Oh, I thought we were well prepared. We hit the ground. We had some really good leadership in the battery, actually. And we were well briefed on the area that we were going to. We took over an AOR from the Belgians, and they had done a poor job. and not to say that they did anything wrong, but they had indiscriminately distributed money and aid, and a lot of it we found in warehouses and stuff because people were just stealing it. So then we worked really hard to redistribute that stolen stuff and try and get aid to the people who were actually suffering, and it was a lot of work. We put a lot of boots on the ground and went door to door, talked to everybody in the villages, and found out their situation. And it was a lot of intelligence gathering on who had stolen all the stuff and where it had all gone, because they had put millions of dollars into the area and had nothing. There were still people with no roof on their house, no windows in their houses. All the bullet holes are all still in, and they're, you know, like I came across one couple, they were in their 60s, and, you know, you could tell by their yard that before the war, they had stuff together, and the two of them were sleeping in the cab of a pickup truck because their house was totally wrecked and they had nothing, you know. And so we got them a bed and got them a contractor, a new roof, and got their house back so that they could live in it, you know. And we were giving out wood stoves and stuff like that. So it was rewarding. And we did a lot to fight the local mafia. We brought in the SIGs and we're monitoring cell phones, and I had the British secret squirrel guys. I don't even know who they were, but they would come and they would lay in the bottom of my carrier, and we'd go out and we'd do our patrol as if nothing was going on, and they'd be in there photographing all the mafia. And by the end of the tour, we had the whole hierarchy of the local mafia all laid out. We had seized the mayor of the town's warehouse with millions of dollars in aid hidden in his warehouse, and we accomplished quite a bit. And yeah, it would cause mafia guys lots of trouble. So
can we just take a step back and just tell me what were your first impressions of the place and the people when you first hit the ground? You know,
I liked a lot of the people, and I really disliked a lot of the people. Our interpreters were fantastic people. They were well-educated, well-spoken, and generally, they all had their sides. And some of them really bugged me with their views because they still had a hatred towards Muslims or to the Croats or whichever. And then, yeah, some of the people just really bothered me because they didn't want us there. They didn't think we were helping. They, kids would finger you and try to aggravate you. Like it was the young men who despised us. And I'm not sure exactly why. I don't know what they thought we were about. And at the end of the day, I don't know what we were about, right? Because I wasn't at the top. And you don't hear all the briefings and you don't see the overall picture. But what I did see was just us helping people out. But you get that anywhere. Young men always want to pick the fight. That's, I guess, what they do. So,
where were you, and what did it physically look like when you got there?
Well, we landed in VK, and we spent 4 days in VK because we were taken over from the Belgians, and apparently we sat there in VK waiting for our camp to have something. So we rolled down to Tomislavgrad, And we got there, and all they had was the ISO trailers laid out, and we were living in mud. It was a ton of mud, and they were currently trucking in gravel and trying to clean it up. A company, I think it was 2nd Battalion, had been there for a couple of months, because my tour was late. It was an add-on. They called it Roto 6 Plus. So, and it was the first tour that they actually sent the artillery as artillery anywhere since the Korean War. They had sent mortars over with C battery, but they'd never sent an artillery piece anywhere. So we went down there with the guns. We got there was nothing. I spent the first almost month of my tour working with the carpenters, because I had worked in the trades. My dad's a carpenter, my brother's a carpenter, and I was a drywaller, and so I knew how to run tools and all that. And as soon as they figured that out, that was my sentence for the first month, building trusses. And it drove me nuts because they were building everything by hand. I'm like, why didn't you guys just order trusses? And they're like, from where? Oh yeah, you know. And so guys were going out on patrols and seeing the country, and I was sitting there hammering nails. But you know, once that was done, we built ourselves a pretty nice camp. They filled in all the mud with gravel. They put a huge roof over all the ISO trailers, and then a sun deck that connected all the ISO trailers with shower trailers, so you didn't have to, like when you went to the shower, you didn't have to go through the dirt. And then about after the first month, then we were rotating in and out of Glamache in my troop. And in Glamache, we lived in a mod tent and didn't have showers. We were attached to the British camp, which was nice because they weren't as strict on their beer rules as the Canadians were. But they don't live in the same standard as the Canadians, the British. Like, I went for a shower in their showers, and you were standing in ankle-deep muddy water, and like it wasn't anywhere near to the standard that the Canadians built their camps. But it was nice because we would be just our one detachment up there, living in the mod tent and away from the direct supervision. And we did our patrols of Glamache. Daily we did 12-hour patrols, and they varied in times. And the other troop in the battery, they did the rural areas. So they had long drives, and we just patrolled a little city and had a couple issues. There was a couple of bombings and some shootings and things like that, but for the most part, it was a quiet little town of about 3,500 people that we looked after. We also looked after the security for the British camp, because they were all just ammo techs and truckers, and it blew me away. They didn't even have rifles. They had them there, but they were in a weapons vault. Whereas, you know, we carried our rifle everywhere we went, and we were fully bombed up and ready for battle everywhere. We had machine guns and rocket launchers, and you know, we were ready all the time. And yeah, they didn't even have their rifle in their trailer. So
just tell me, you told that great anecdote about the couple living in the pickup truck. Well, what about the rest of the people in that? Like, what did that town? Was the town like half destroyed? What kind of shape was the town in itself?
The town was in really rough shape. It had seen a lot of fighting. There was a lot of mine activity in the hills around it. It was right on the front line. Most of the buildings were wrecked in the town. a few things had been kind of restored. The coffee shop. I remember there was an enormous apartment building, and it was completely empty, and it had huge holes in it. And I just kept thinking to myself, like, I don't even know if you could fix that apartment building, but where are all those people? Because people had their houses, but all these apartments were empty, and I don't know where the people went. And that was another thing that we were working on that tour is during the war, as the Croatians came through or the Serbs came through, people were displaced of different ethnicity. And one of the big focuses on our tour was to try and get people back to their original homes throughout the country. I think we just started that, so we didn't actually see anybody move, but it was gathering intelligence about who lived there and who was supposed to live there. And nobody that I saw, other than the mayor, had a nice house. Few had a roof. It was pretty rough living, and which was really surprised me because I think the war ended in 1995 or 96, and here it was 4 or 5 years later, and they're still camping. I think that bothered me too, because myself, I would have worked every day to improve my home. There was trees around, there was stuff, like I would have got a roof on my house somehow. But they didn't. They just sat back and smoked their smokes and drank their Slevo. And I don't know, I wasn't there for what they had been through, but I don't know if I would have just sat there.
Or were they waiting for NATO to fix it for them, or?
I guess. And we were slowly working at it. There was, and NATO wasn't paying for any of that. There was aid agencies, and our job was to connect the people to the various agencies. We did have beds and wood stoves. Aside from that, it was just hooking a guy up with the UNHCR and the other agencies that could hire contractors and get them to come in and build a roof. But
is there a day or an incident that stands out for you as memorable from this tour?
There was the big excitement day for me. I was out on a patrol, and we'd brought in the LDSH with the coyotes, and they were, because there had been several shootings and several bombings, they brought in the coyote to do overwatch over the town. And so they radioed me, and there was apparently 3 guys up on the roof shooting AK-47s. And we weren't sure if they were shooting them at people or what they were doing. So we took off running towards them, and talking to them on the radio, they said, okay, we see you, they're inside that building. And I was in charge of this 3-man patrol, and there was 3 guys on the roof, and there was nobody else in the area that we could call to get there. My section commander was with the carrier, and I can't remember exactly why he couldn't bring the carrier there, but they sent us in the building. I was way more worried about going into this bombed out building with, you know, broken stairs, and I assumed booby trapped or what, because people don't go in them, and that was my big scare, was that, you know, we wouldn't even get to where these guys were, you know, and it was one of the most terrifying things I ever did. We never found the guys, but you know, like we got authorized to chamber rounds, and you know, we were supposed to go in and stop these guys from doing it. I'm not sure what we would have done when we got there, but you know, it really was one of those moments where you really, I really felt that, you know, things were going to go south there. They didn't, and there was no booby traps in the building, and we all came out of there safe. And like I said, we never found the guys. I don't know where they took off to, but.
Who were these bombings and shootings? Who was being targeted, and by whom, or did you have a sense of that?
I think the majority of the targets were Muslims, and it was Croatian sympathizers. There was a large group. In fact, the town that we patrolled, Glamoch, flew a Croatian flag in the middle of the town, even though it was Bosnia and it's not Croatia. You know, it was supposed to be the, you know, the mixing pot of people. There was a large percentage of Muslims living in that area, and they were the target of. So there was a cafe that was run by Muslims, and they blew that up. I don't remember what the other bombings were, but you know, they were fairly small bombings. Like I wouldn't, other than the cafe, they blew that up real good, but they were kind of, and drive-by shootings and that kind of stuff. You know, nothing too serious, but there wasn't very many Serbs in the area, so I would have thought they would have got targeted as well. There was still a lot of hate between the Croatians and the other groups.
And what about the dangers to your own security and your fellow soldiers' security? What were, in reality, what were those dangers?
I don't think there was really much. We went there loaded for war. Like we had ridiculous amounts of firepower everywhere we went. We had a Grizzly with a 50 cal and a C6 on it. We had 2 C6s in the Grizzly. We had 2 C9s with us. Like when we deployed, we almost had no rifles. Like everybody had a rifle, but if it came to fighting, we were almost straight machine guns, just the way it worked out. When we were doing the workup training, we were doing a defensive, and they brought in an infantry sergeant, and he was going to do an assessment of how we did. And so we laid out all this stuff, and he goes, well, you know, you got these machine guns that aren't on the flanks and this, that, and the other thing. And we're like, well, we got machine guns on the flanks. And he's like, well, how many machine guns do you guys have? And we started laying it all out, and he's like, holy Jesus. Like, because, you know, they wanted, I guess, to make sure that the guns weren't in any danger whatsoever. So I did not feel like, you know, there was any kind of threat that would even bother to take us on. We were just too heavily armed. Looking back on it, maybe that was just a perception. Knowing what I know now, and the guerrilla tactics that desperate people can take, we would have been a very easy target. But I still looked at it from a conventional war and the loss of for such a small gain would never have been worth it. But I see nowadays that absolutely we would have been an easy target. But I've never looked at things that way in my whole life. I've never felt like any of those bad things would ever happen to me. You hear about them, but it will never happen to me. So,
what kinds of guns did you deploy with, and did you ever use them during the tour?
No, we just did straight training with the howitzers. We took the LG-1, and it was something the government had just bought us, a French gun. It was a terrible gun, but it was a light 105 millimeter howitzer, and they did Grizzly APCs, beefed up the rear suspension so that it could tow the gun, and so we towed the guns with a Grizzly and used HLVWs for ammo limbers. So we would go to the Glamotch ranges and do shooting with the guns, but other than that, they sat in sea containers overseas. The threat never got to a level where we would have deployed howitzers. There was, like I said, the war was over. We had all that stuff there just as a deterrent. You know, like the Americans were there. There was Apaches and A-10s and F-16s and F-18s, and like the full brunt of the Allied Army. And that was plenty of deterrent. I don't think they needed the howitzers there, but it's nice having the all-weather option, right?
What was it like for you as a young soldier to be exposed to this sort of multinational environment?
I remember the first time we went for, they used the Czech army to move our guns with the hips. And I remember I never went in it because I always drove the carrier, but the guys come in and there's a massive hole in the floor, and they were like, I think the pilot was wearing shorts. He had his uniform on in the top and wearing shorts underneath and sandals. So it was interesting. We had a lot of, like, we ran into problems. The Americans wouldn't move our guns with Blackhawks because they didn't have 4 points of contact on the gun, and every other country could use 3. And the Brits would fly us around with the Chinooks, and the Czechs with the hips, and it was interesting. All sorts of different countries paraded through our camp, and you'd sit and have lunch with a guy, and you know, I had lunch with a guy from Norway, and it was certainly confidence inspiring, having all of that power, you know, to back you up, and neat to see all those countries invested in one solution, right?
What about what was the regular reserve mix, and how did the two solitudes get together, or did it work well?
Well, I don't remember what the official number was. I think it was 30% reservists. Did it work well? It did. But you had to have thick skin, because a large percentage of them didn't want us there. And it was quite popular to pick on, they called us Mo for militia, but so they would pick on the Mo, and you know, like, we would give it back, and I would say that you know, today it would be full-blown harassment, but you know, it was just expected then. And if you took it personally. You didn't last. They got rid of you. It was, I didn't find it that hard to deal with. I've always had a decent personality for that. I can take a decent ribbing, and I gave it back whenever I could. And so my detachment was, it was 10 guys, and 2 of us were reservists. So, you know, like, it was, you didn't have a lot of ammunition, but the other reserve guy, they made us roommates. Clint, he was from Manitoba, a funny guy. When I first met him, I thought he was about 40, and a huge mustache, and he was balding. And we were chatting, and he was 23 years old. And like, full on, complete redneck cowboy guy, eh? We got along pretty good. Funny guy, though.
So ultimately, how satisfying was this deployment for you?
Very satisfying. I really didn't like my my detachment commander, but other than that, I thought it was fantastic. But I actually work in a jail now as a correctional officer, and I look back on that, and that is the closest I think you could get to being in jail. We did our work, and outside of that, we lived behind barbed wire, and all of our movements were scrutinized, and we absolutely were never allowed out of the camp. We were restricted to, we could go to the gym. We had a little mess that you could go have 2 beer and not another one. And then, you know, the kitchen, they even guarded the food. Like, you know, like, if I could have changed one thing, it would have been that they would have trusted us to be able to, you know, to make some decisions. But I guess an army doesn't really work that way. So.
What kinds of decisions?
Well, like, there was a number of people who would go to town and go and, I'm not sure exactly what they were doing in the local area, but they would go. You know, like, I think that people could have made responsible decisions on alcohol. I think that, and maybe I'm wrong, but I think that the approach that they took was so stifling that, you know, when guys did get out on their own, they kind of went a little crazy, right? And it just, they were treating it as though well, they told us we couldn't even eat the pizza in the country because the dairy wasn't up to their standards. You know, like, I think pizza will be fine. You know, like, the average guy, you know, 20-year-old guy leaves pizza sitting on his counter for 3 days and still eats it, right? So I don't think Bosnian pizza is any worse. So.
Did you get an HLTA on this tour?
I did, yes.
So what did you do with that?
I went, and my dad is fresh off the boat from Norway. So I went and spent 4 or 5 days with his sister in Norway. Then I traveled up to a more remote part of Norway and hung out with my cousin for a little while. And then I toured down through, I had a Euro rail pass, and I went down through Holland and Germany. Saw a couple of things.
What about coming home? How did you physically come home? Like, how were you routed and how were you received?
We flew to Scotland, and then we flew to, I think we stopped in Trenton, and then we landed in Winnipeg, and then they bused us to Shiloh. And the next morning I jumped in my pickup truck and drove to Alberta. I was surprised that it still ran, actually, after it sat there for 6 months. But
and so no one met you, like, did somebody meet you? Was there any kind of a reception?
No. Well, customs. They've charged me for an extra bottle.
So it's sort of this big anticlimax coming home in a way?
I wasn't expecting anything. My family was never they never ever came to anything I ever did in the Army, so I wasn't expecting them to come to that. I think it took me about 5 or 6 days. I made my way out to Victoria, and then as soon as I got home, I took a Class B contract, actually, as the quartermaster here. I did that for 3.5 years after that. So in a way, it was, I just basically rolled right back into work, and I think I only took 2 weeks off when I got home, and I just started working. And
so because you did the Class B, it was a pretty easy transition to go from overseas back to life in Alberta?
Yeah, I wouldn't have had any troubles transitioning from overseas. Like I said, it was more of a law enforcement gig than a like the tours that I'd heard about, you know. And I remember I was talking to a major or something like that, and he said, "Well, you show signs of PTSD or whatever." And I was like, "Man, just because you go overseas doesn't mean you get it." Like, there was nothing that happened on my tour that would have left anybody feeling, and I don't know that for sure, but I certainly didn't come home with any, I didn't feel any different when I came home. I didn't feel like I had even really done anything that Army, you know what I mean? It was we checked paperwork and helped people get wood stoves and beds, you know, like it was pretty easy tour.
Was it disappointing in that regard, that it wasn't more exciting?
Everybody wants to be tested, right? Like, but I never wished that on my tour. But when all the tours came out to Afghanistan, and it absolutely just didn't work out with my lifestyle, but I wanted to go so bad. But I had just started a new career. I had just started kids. They were, my daughter was 6 months old when they first went in 06. And I just, you know, I didn't think my wife was actually there enough that she could have dealt with it herself, so I never went. Always wanted to. You always want to know, you always have that question, right? Like, I've trained all these years to do this, can I actually do it? You know what I mean? And I'll probably never get that answer at this point.
So you don't think at this point, you don't envision yourself deploying another time?
Well, actually, I'm at a point right now in my life where if something came up, I could go. I'm well established in my career. My kids are almost 10 years old, or 9 and 11. So, you know, they're at a point now where it would be okay for me to go. I just don't see anything on the horizon. We'll see, maybe the Ukraine will light up or something, but and I would go, and I've got 6 years left. The problem is that, you know, as a master warrant officer, there's so few jobs. It would be tough to get on anything, so I've pretty much given up.
When you look back at this experience in Bosnia, how do you think did it change or affect you in any way as a person, as a soldier? Change your outlook?
I think I went over there very close-minded. I was a young guy, and I grew up in a close-minded family. They're fairly right-wing, and it kind of allowed me to see things sort of from the other side of the fence. You know, if you had grown up on Vancouver Island or in Alberta your whole life, you know, you don't really see suffering. It's not there. Yeah, we got some homeless people, but they're not really suffering even. You know, they get their handouts every day, and at least when I went over there, I saw people really suffering. And I talked to a lot of people. I talked to them about their situations, and you know, I asked them questions like, why don't you do this to improve this? Or, you know, and it was interesting to see a different perspective on it. Because you watch the news, and it's always, you know, like I deployed for the Calgary floods, and I watched the news about what I was there doing, and 90% of Calgary was just normal. You know, it was only 5% of it that had water on it. But the news would have led you to believe that the entire city was underwater, you know? And so you have to, you know, when you're watching the news, you have to take it with a grain of salt, because they show you the very worst. But in Bosnia and Croatia, they didn't show any of the bad. They just didn't cover it. You know, it was almost like we weren't there. So it taught me to look at things objectively, and it was good experience for a young guy to know that whatever's on TV certainly isn't real, and that reality is a long way from the story you get. And that served me well in my jail career, because you kind of pick some of the fly shit out of the pepper, right? So.
Is there anything that we haven't talked about that you want to say to wrap it up?
I don't really think, I can't think of anything off the top of my head, no.
Oh, thanks very much.
Okay.